Okay, so before I start this video, I should really stress that it's kind of important to watch the whole thing and not just part of it, because the first half will be answering one question, and then the second will be explaining and exploring the follow-up question, which is really more important. So the first half of this video will just address the question, do video games cause aggression? And although that sounds simple, it is not. Psychologists have been testing it for a long time, and they find it really hard to measure aggression in a way that makes it so that the conclusions they draw from their studies are actually generalizable. And there have been huge studies on either side of the argument, having plenty of data and logic to support themselves. In general, it can be agreed upon that there is a correlation between an individual's level of aggression and their use of violent media, particularly video games. But just like any other correlation, this one can have multiple explanations. Probably the most common explanation for the correlation is the Socialization Hypothesis, which states that video games cause aggression. And that hypothesis has been pretty well researched. An alternative theory is the Selection Hypothesis, which is that people who are aggressive and angry people anyway will go out and select violent video games to play, and that's why the correlation exists. The third explanation is that there's one variable that will make people aggressive and play video games. To test the third variable hypotheses, researchers have taken into account gender, history of past aggression, parental involvement, parental education levels, parent-child relationship quality, number of at-risk background factors, number of computers in the home, depressive symptoms, peer deviance, sports involvement, academic achievement, delay of gratification, friendship quality, and school culture. And despite taking all those things into account, psychologists have still found a significant correlation between violent video game use and aggression. So the third variable hypothesis isn't really that popular anymore. The Selection Hypothesis has also been tested, and people have looked at aggressive people and tried to figure out if they're more likely to play violent video games. Some research supports this hypothesis, but those are mostly studies that are done on general violent media like TV and movies. Then some studies have found that people aren't really that much more likely to choose violent video games if they are aggressive people, and even if they do, that doesn't account for the entirety of the correlation. So this leaves us with the Socialization Hypothesis, which is that violent video games teach people to be more aggressive. And there's been a meta-analysis that concludes that this is the way things are, and meta-analyses are usually like the most substantial thing there is when trying to come up with a conclusion, especially in psychology and the social sciences. Because if you run one study and try to conclude something off of that, the amount of variance that happens makes it so that there's always like a 5% chance that all of your data came to be the way it did based on coincidence. And with that 5%, that means that like 1 in 20 studies are going to be wrong. But what a meta-analysis does is it collects all the studies that have been done on a particular topic and joins them together, so that 5% basically shrinks to negligible. Because if dozens of studies are all concluding the same thing, that means the findings have been pretty replicatable. And sure enough, there is a meta-analysis concluding that video games do indeed cause aggression. However, it's more complicated than that, because there's also a meta-analysis or two pointing out that that's not the case. A researcher by the name of Ferguson points out that the original meta-analysis that does conclude that video games cause aggression didn't take publication bias into account. So there might have been dozens or hundreds of studies that have concluded that video games don't cause aggression, but only that 5% of wrong studies ended up published. So publication bias is a really important thing to take into account when you're trying to draw a giant conclusion like that. Ferguson even suggested that if you correct for the publication bias, all the causation just goes away and disappears, and it doesn't matter anymore. And in another meta-analysis in 2001, somebody concluded that there might be a little causation, but it's very small, and it's not even as big as the causation for movies that cause aggression. So it's really hard to tell why there's that publication bias, but there is, and it might be because there really isn't that much of a causation there. It might be that violent video games don't really cause aggression, but it also might be that those studies weren't really done all that well in the first place, and they had small sample sizes, and studies with small sample sizes don't really have all that conclusive evidence in favor of anything, usually. So overall, it kinda looks like there is some causation. Violent video games do cause aggression, but it's a very small amount of it. However, knowing that there is that tiny little influence, you should also keep into account that between the ages of 12 and 17, 97% of people play video games, and about half of the top 10 most popular video games do contain violent content. So even though the amount of influence violent video games have is tiny, it's a tiny influence over a ton of people. So if we assume that the answer to the original question is yes, violent video games do cause a tiny amount of aggression, then it's still important to ask the question, what do we do about it? And in order to answer that question, you can't just look at the negative consequences of playing violent video games, you have to look at the positives as well. And since video games and minds are both really complicated things, it's pretty predictable that the impact they have on minds is pretty complicated. A lot of video games actually increase your cognitive abilities, and particularly action video games, which are notorious for violence, increase your spatial reasoning skills. Many video games even promote pro-social behavior and helping behavior and liking people and like the opposite of aggression, and those are just the objective aspects of its positive influence. Video game as an art form is just really subjectively cool. There's a lot of things that video games do that other media can't quite do as well. A ton of people my age seem to regard Ocarina of Time as the most nostalgic and happy childhood thing that they have. And if you think about it, that makes sense because the game is targeted at like 7-year-olds and the main character for a while is 7 and you get to explore the world and it's really exciting, and since you're the one playing the video game, it's kind of you exploring the world. You decide what to explore and what to do. And you just run into all this stuff, and a lot of it just doesn't matter. Like, you don't care if some things are wooden and other things aren't. And there's a lot of big weird things that don't look like they're ever going to matter. And then a little ways into the game, you actually grow up, and that's kinda cool. In the game, it makes sense. And then you get to explore the world again. And now, since you have a hook shot that hooks onto wooden things, it does matter that things are made of wood, and all the big things that didn't look like they were going to matter at first now matter a lot, and are actually really significant puzzles. And a lot of the things you liked as a kid are either destroyed or they're too small to matter. And that's a lot like growing up actually is. Like when you're a kid, there's all sorts of things that are just too big and stupid and you don't care about them. And then as an adult, there are all sorts of things that you miss as a kid that you feel like you'll never be able to go back to. So it makes sense that Zelda is a nostalgic game, because it's not only a reminiscent on our childhood, but it's a reminiscence on the moment in our childhood where we were getting our first glimpse of real adulthood. And it would be really sad to restrict video games, because they're capable of so much stuff like that. Plus, if you're going to limit video games, you have to also restrict a bunch of other things, because movies have been shown to be even more influential on aggression. Different styles of books can also have positive or negative impacts on various psychological qualities. Some promote empathy, some don't. Studies have shown that listening to certain genres of music will actually make you value physical attractiveness in partners more than other qualities. Even watching musicals has had an impact on people's political opinions and general cognition, especially people who actually really enjoyed it. So like, the more good an art form is, and the more you connect with it, the more influence it's going to have on you. And if you want to watch a movie that is illegal for your age group, you probably can figure out how to do that. If we made violent video games illegal, I'm sure you'd still be able to play violent video games. So that brings us back to the original follow-up question, what do we do? So we can go back to the research and see what makes the impact that violent video games have on aggression more or less intense. Researchers have found that people who are more prone to anger in the first place are more influenced by the aggressive qualities of video games. They also found that if you hold traditional masculine ideologies, you're more susceptible to the influence. If when somebody hurts you, you assume it's because they didn't like you instead of assuming it's by accident or something, then you're more susceptible to the influence of violent video games. And a little bit of slightly more useful information is that children who are more monitored by their parents are less influenced by violent video games. So maybe instead of putting restrictions on violent video games, we just make people less susceptible. If you like the smell of roses but hate the feel of thorns, it doesn't make sense to throw away the rose, just take off the thorns. Instead of putting restrictions on video games, just make people less susceptible to the negative impacts. If an increase in parental involvement makes people less susceptible to video games, then increase parental monitoring. And there are probably plenty of other factors that contribute to the susceptibility. Another thing that probably impacts it is the belief in the Catharsis Hypothesis. The Catharsis Hypothesis is that when you're angry, you should let out your aggression on anything, and then it'll make you less aggressive overall after that. You should find an outlet and beat the crap out of a punching bag or scream into a pillow. And this hypothesis kind of makes sense if you think about it, and irrationalizes doing whatever you feel like doing, so lots of people believe in it. There is even some empirical support of this hypothesis when it was first proposed, but since then it's been completely disproved. There are plenty of studies that show that punching bags don't help, taking your anger out will basically just make you practice taking your anger out when you're angry. If you always hit stuff when you're angry, then somebody makes you angry, you're probably gonna hit them. And a lot of people believe that the Catharsis Hypothesis is true, even though it's really not. It doesn't even work if you really believe in it. Even the placebo isn't strong enough to make this work. So if you try to play violent video games to take out your aggression, then that's probably gonna make you more aggressive. If you learn to shoot people in the head, even in a video game, every time you're mad, that's a horrible thing to learn. So you should just do other stuff when you're mad, like laugh or take a break from something or meditate or whatever works for you. Another possible moderator of the aggressive influence of violent video games is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is basically an unpleasant mental state that happens when your beliefs or behaviors directly contradict other beliefs or behaviors that you have. So if you believe something, it's probably going to lead to action. But actions also lead to beliefs. Like the belief that one race is better than another might make you act in a racist way. But also, acting in a not racist way makes you have less racist beliefs. Researchers have done a study where they took people who were kinda racist and made them write essays that were in favor of ending segregation, and those people were less racist at the end of the study. And one reason this is relevant to video games in particular is that if you believe that hurting people is bad, and then in a video game you hurt people, the hurting people might influence you to not believe that hurting people is as bad as you originally thought it was. There's some research that does support this too. If you design an avatar in the game to look like you feel like you're doing the things, so it actually has a stronger impact on you. And the aggressive impact is also a little stronger when the game is really realistic, so it feels like you're actually doing those things, and it feels like it's actual behavior that you have to rationalize. And this could be solved just by rationalizing things in a slightly different way. Like, probably for the most part, when you kill people in video games, it doesn't make you believe that killing people is not all that bad. You probably just say that, oh, I'm not actually killing people because these are all just pixels and pixel can't feel pain. It's when you rationalize killing people in a way that can be generalized to reality that it probably becomes a problem. Like if you just say, oh, some people deserve to be shot in the head, then that's a bad way to rationalize the things you're doing, and there's definitely a better one. So yeah, video games might be making the world a tiny bit more aggressive, particularly the violent ones, the bloody ones, the competitive ones, and the frustrating ones. So there probably would be less violence in the world if Mortal Kombat wasn't in the world. There would also be less violence if Game of Thrones wasn't in the world. Teens might make better romantic decisions if it weren't for Twilight. People might not be as sexist if it weren't for hip-hop. But that doesn't mean we should take those things out of the world completely, because a lot of people really enjoy them, and it would be really a lot better to just keep the good and find a way to keep them from causing bad. So all you can really do is try to learn more about the issue and try to make yourself as unsusceptible as possible. You can educate yourself probably by looking in the description. I tried to cite this stuff pretty well, so just read as much as you want. Also feel free to comment and discuss all this stuff, and I'd be interested to see what you might think also might cause increased susceptibility to the impact of violent video games, so definitely comment any ideas you might have, and then maybe someone will test them someday. Either way, it can't hurt to think.